Hello, welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester, I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's Hammer Conversation with Scott Sternberg and Kevin West. The Hammer Conversation series pairs creative thinkers from a range of disciplines for engaging, provocative discussions on culture, science, and the arts. And I'm very excited about tonight's guests, Scott Sternberg and Kevin West. Scott Sternberg is a fashion designer, photographer, and entrepreneur who founded the brand Band of Outsiders in 2004. Kevin West is a journalist, author, and canning evangelist. He spent 13 years on staff at W Magazine, and since 2009, he's run the blog savingtheseason.com about the cuisine and culture of food preservation. His first book is Saving the Season, A Cook's Guide to Home Canning, Pickling, and Preserving, and Kevin will be signing books in the lobby following the discussion tonight. For this program, Sternberg and West discuss the surprising overlap between fashion and food, nostalgia and authenticity, and the freedom of working in Los Angeles, where everything old is new again. So please join me in welcoming Scott Sternberg and Kevin West.
Hello, everybody. Here we are.
Good evening.
Is the curtain opening up at some point? I guess we should start by saying thank you for the curtain. And thank you to the Hammer and Claudia and Annie and our bud Dave over there, David Morehouse,
Yes.
who were kind enough to invite us here to babble on about what we do and why we do it and all that stuff. I guess I'll sort of jump in here. There we are. So, Kevin, we met how long ago, would you say?
Well, let's see, I moved here in 2004, and it was not that fall. I think it was the next fall, wasn't it?
I think it was that fall.
It was that fall.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it
well,
was
I was barely off the plane then.
Yeah. And we were at a Halloween party, and you were dressed as the devil.
The devil.
And I was,
And
and
he
I
was
was
dressed
dressed as the Boy Scout.
a Boy Scout.
And here we are. It's like however many years later, and you wrote a book, which is pretty rad. It's, for those of you who, I mean, you heard from Claudia's introduction, Saving the Season is this sort of movement, I would say, Kevin sort of started a few years ago. First as a blog, and then it just got released as a book. And it's really this amazing thing. I think your publisher is packaging it as a cookbook. But it's really this compendium of all things canning and jamming and preserving. And more than that, it's this sort of kind of autobiographical, nostalgic look into your past and how you sort of tied all that to your career and where you are now.
And that's really what people are wondering now is like, how does any of that relate to fashion?
How does any of that relate to this, which is what you were doing when I met you? Because the first thing I think of when I think of pickles is fashion. One of the things we're really, the general theme of tonight is sort of this idea of making connections where they're not so obvious. So maybe you could make that connection for us.
Yeah, that's not the easiest one to make, is it? I don't know. And the question maybe is like, sort of, how did I get from slide 1 to slide 2? And the answer is really brief, which is unhappiness. You know, every story of change begins with unhappiness, right? Like there's one thing that you're doing, and you want to be doing something else. But then I think the more interesting question is, what's the difference between the one and the other, but what are the similarities?
What's the through line, yeah.
Yeah, what's the through line? And the thing I was at W for 13 years, and the thing that you learn at a magazine, especially a magazine that's devoted to producing images of glamour, is that there's absolutely nothing glamorous about working at a magazine. Like what happens within the pages of the magazine is a world that's created, and it's created. It's an imaginative world. It's a creative world, and it's made in order to generate emotions. And for the magazine, for W, we could talk about what those emotions are, but they have to do with desire. They have to do with a consumerist lust.
Sure.
They have to do with all kinds of things. And I think what I took away from the time of that I was at the magazine and applied to Saving the Season is that a published product is an occasion, is an opportunity to invite people into a world that is both visual and written, both visual and literary, in hopes of trying to create in the reader or in the visitor some kind of emotion. Now, I'm interested in different emotions with Saving the Season, obviously, but,
Sure.
but still there's, like, that was the lesson that I learned, was that you can create emotions.
Practically, when you're sitting there and you're working at this magazine, which is essentially not falling apart, but the magazine industry is falling apart. What was that moment of change, that sort of catalyst? When did that happen for you? How did you decide to do this? Like, what? I think that's probably somewhat interesting to people. We were talking about this, we were talking about our talk. We were talking about this idea of the cliche of following your bliss, and how that's something we sort of have both shared in our careers.
Yeah, it's sort of an Oprah phrase, an Oprah turn of phrase, but the thing is, you know, I became aware. So, okay, I worked at W in New York, and then they sent me to Paris, and that was a lot of fun, and then I came here, and then there was a moment when I started to think that perhaps I'd been doing the same thing for a long time, and then there was a moment when, you know, like, it seemed like the publishing industry was really, didn't have the brightest future, you know, and then there was a moment, and this moment was like fall of 2008 into spring of 2009. Do you all remember that moment?
That was a rough moment.
Yeah.
That was a rough moment for the clothing industry. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I remember being in the office with a friend of ours, Gabby, my boss at the time, and watching the stock market, like hearing about the stock market, and feeling in the pit of my stomach this desperate fear, not because I was losing money in the market, but because I thought I was about to lose my job,
Sure. Because
the magazine was going to fold, the industry was going to collapse, the world was going to fall apart, and like, then what? And so, you know, like, I've needed to figure out a lifeboat.
Word.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could.
Yeah, well, but Scott, I would ask you that same question. Like, so Scott's biography is also one of transformation, or of, you know, or of changing it up, if you prefer that. You know, he was at CAA, and then he left.
It's me at CAA. Show me the money.
He left a job that people really kill to get into, in order to pursue something that was very uncertain, let's say. And I can imagine on the day that you walked out the door at CAA, there must have been people who really questioned your sanity.
Yeah.
So what provoked that decision?
You know, and I don't mean this disparagingly to Creative Artists Agency. It's actually a kind of wonderful company. But the day I started there, I knew I was out of there. It was not built for me. So the whole time I was not built for that. I was really just sort of, I was young, and I had this incredible opportunity to have this great job and this expense account and all these clients, and really these mentors who help you understand how to sort of manipulate people and manipulate situations to your advantage, quite simply. Which, as a budding entrepreneur and somebody who had always felt that bug, I knew was quite valuable. The relationships, the specific knowledge of movies and any of that stuff didn't seem to matter. But so it was so super easy to walk out. And really what happened, I moved to LA to be in the movie business, but 2 years later, at the most, I was out of the movie business, and I was in, you know, digital content, entertainment marketing, and all that stuff.
Right.
So I'd already sort of made that shift. And then by the time I, you know, had an opportunity where it really felt like, again, there was a shift that you're describing, sort of a downturn. But when I left CAA, it just sort of felt like, in the clothing industry specifically, this is, you know, 10, 11 years ago, when in menswear, which is how I started, it wasn't so exciting. It was all European houses. You know, it was this, I loved to shop. I had money to shop. It was how I made myself feel good about my job. So I was fully aware of what was out there. And it wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't what I liked and all that stuff. So there was this sort of very fluid sort of year where I wasn't really questioning myself at all, but I was just sort of in training, where I took some classes to learn how to illustrate, make patterns, or at least talk to a pattern maker, you know, sort of all that crafty sort of stuff. And you know, I just sort of, the second there was an opportunity, I just bolted.
Yeah, yeah. It's maybe an unanswerable thing, but it is something that is curious to me. I mean, I've known you, and we're really close friends. But it's hard to understand that that sort of moment where something switches over,
Yeah.
and the idea that that when you made this decision to be a designer, to be a fashion designer, like did you draw growing up? Did you dress up your Ken doll and in clothes that you made?
No, I mean, we talked about this. I think you remember when I started making women's clothes, which was several years in, and even a year into that, I remember having a conversation with you where I was talking about something very designery, like draping something on a dress form, and you said to me, "Well, poof, you're a fashion designer now." And I really didn't, until that point, consider myself a designer. I thought I was an entrepreneur who had an idea for a product, and it wasn't about having a runway show and sort of waving to everybody and doing any of that stuff. I had this feeling of this brand that happened to primarily express itself in clothes. So I started making shirts and ties, and that seemed pretty easy to do for the most part. I could go to a store and pick out a shirt I liked, so I was essentially picking fabric. Same with ties, and that was it. It was there's two moments that happen. There's an abstract moment where you sort of feel this desire for change, that sort of quarter-life crisis thing that was coined a few years ago. And you can feel that you want something different, and you're heading towards something different. And you can even take that a step further. I'm an entrepreneur. I don't want to provide a service as I did at CAA. I want to make a product. And then there's the moment of specificity, which is really the scary one, because that's when your identity changes, and your sort of even your self-image, because you just kind of have to say, like, I'm a fashion designer, or.
Isn't that such an interesting thing? You asked me the other day, kind of jokingly, if there was anything I missed about, not jokingly, you asked me if there was anything I miss about W. And I said, not entirely jokingly, yeah, there's something I miss, the expense account.
Yeah.
But there's, if you sort of unfold that a little bit, what I really think I mean is that, one misses an expense account, but but like a magazine or an institution, working for W, working for CAA, it gives you a place in the world. And when someone asks you, what do you do, because that's a question we get asked all the time, you have an answer.
Yeah.
And leaving that institution to have to rely on your own efforts to establish that identity, what I do, like that's really unnerving. And I think that's probably the most, for me, it was one of the sort of challenging parts of this, was figuring out how to be adrift in the world on your own and establish your own platform.
Yeah, and all of that stuff. I mean, it's always that term, that platform thing is sort of the most important thing. You did it with your blog. That was sort of the start, and that allowed you to have something to show to a publisher that was like real, like virtual or digital or whatever, but real. I've always thought of band or used to think of band, I used to say it's a platform to put ideas out into the world, which sounds very nice, and it is, in a very self-indulgent way. It's also a business, and we have to like make clothes and make a margin and all the money and things like that.
Band of Outsiders this evening.
Cute. But you like got it on a discount, so that doesn't serve my point. But yeah, it's, and it's not like it was all easy. I've embarrassed myself and.
Yeah, well, no, but that's a very interesting point as well that I think we probably want to talk about a little bit, which is that when he walked out the door to of CA to be something, he was doing something that he hadn't really been trained in. I mean, maybe college doesn't train any of us for the work that we do after college, but still, usually there's some sort of general drift. There's some sort of correspondence between what you've studied and what you wind up doing. And for both of us, there's this really interesting rupture where we had to train ourselves to do something.
Train yourself and sort of just accept authority and sort of just embody yourself with that to some extent. Like I said one day, I'm a fashion designer. Poof. Like that's all that it really takes.
Right.
That's all that it takes to start. And then there's a lot of work and all that. But in terms of we were talking about this that I thought was interesting as well, which is this. I mean, what you're doing now? Do you consider yourself a chef or a?
No, absolutely not. No, I'm not a chef.
So essentially, you're a writer.
Yeah. I mean, if I had my druthers, I would say that I'm a reporter. I like that word. I feel like it aligns with my natural inclination to go out and ask people questions and write down their answers and to do research. And it also reflects my favorite part of what I was doing before at a magazine, which is journalism. So I just have shifted subjects now.
And your relationship with the subject is totally different because instead of interviewing a celebrity or a socialite, you're actually you're making something and then writing about the process of doing that and then tying it to your past and.
Yeah, well, this anticipates something I know we wanted to talk about maybe at a later point. But but the question is, if you're, let's see, the question is one of narrative. Like if you're reporting something and want to put it out in the world, like how do you make that into an interesting subject?
Mm-hmm. How do you romance it?
How do you romance it?
It's the same with a clothing line. You want to put a clothing line out into the world. Yeah. You have to tell everybody what your inspiration is, and it should be very pat and fit into like 3 sentences, and something that's quotable so people can repeat it. And I don't mean to put that down. It's important. Context is really everything with clothing. It's a shirt is a shirt is a shirt. Mm-hmm. To a large extent, but I cut you off.
Yeah. Well, I'm not.
That's
sure
my way of throwing the baton back to you.
But I say at some point in the book that the book is a recipe book, right? It's 220 recipes, half sweet, half savory, preserves, fermented vegetables, all of that. There probably are not that many people in this room tonight who are interested in making their own kimchi, or like dill pickles or whatever, and that's cool. Like I don't have a problem with that. But the book also has the stories, and the recipes are vehicles for the stories, and the stories I hope are involved in larger cultural questions or larger cultural issues or a larger cultural moment. Let's put it that way. And I think that's another place where you and I overlap. Like we set ourselves specific problems. Like you set yourself the specific problem of how to make a men's shirt that is not boring.
Sure.
And I set myself a specific problem: how to make my grandmother's strawberry jam in such a way that it sort of resonates with my memory. Like those are technical issues, but then they become the solutions to our technical dilemmas perhaps are connected to other larger issues that we can talk about. And I think that's why you and I both like what we're doing. Like you're not. I'm
not at all limited by making clothes.
You're not a garmento, if I can say that. Can I say that?
What's that?
You're not a garmento.
I am not a garmento. I can talk to garmentos. I can talk like a garmento.
Yeah.
I'm very Jewy, which has in the Venn diagram of garmento and Jewy, I'm right in the middle.
And I'm not a chef because like I'm interested in not just the what's on the plate, but like this whole culture of the table around the plate. So I've got a different angle on it.
Yeah, but you can hang with the foodies, like the best of them.
No, you can hang with the garmentos.
And the fashion people, to some extent. Okay, should we talk about nostalgia?
Yeah.
That's my bar mitzvah. I was very popular with the girls. Yeah. So, if you read Kevin's book and if you sort of experience any of the imagery around my brand, or you go to opening ceremony, a shop in town, there's a room that we built out of Legos. I just did a collaboration for men's and women's with Atari, the video game maker. You know that we're sort of obsessed with this idea of nostalgia, and it's something that's quite authentic. It's not really an idea of nostalgia. It's my way of sort of, you were talking a little bit before about sort of creating desire and sort of enticing people, titillating people about my brand and my clothes. That's sort of my through line. It's how it's where the emotion comes in. In terms of your book, when I've read it, it's not at all a cookbook. It's completely this nostalgic sort of thing. Now, my issue has always been the line between nostalgia and twee,
Yeah.
and sort of how to,
Right.
how to sort of deal with that. And what's the foodie equivalent? Where does nostalgia go sour?
Wow. I mean, nostalgia, the difference between nostalgia and twee, when you say that, I'm thinking doilies. So I'm trying to think of what's the food equivalent of doilies? And you see those restaurants. I was just on a book tour through the South, and so you see some of those restaurants where everything is, sort of sophisticated restaurants, where everything is super like grandma's kitchen. There's this very sort of self-conscious kind of yearning to return to a pre-industrial sort of food, local scene, traditional, blah, blah, blah. And I think that risks becoming very twee, like rocking chairs. And, much more interesting to me is, I don't know, something that's very old, some nostalgic part of my sort of Tennessee past, butted up against something very contemporary, like plop down, I don't know, a Michael Malton house in East Tennessee. And I'm like, that's super cool.
That's rad.
So like it seems to me that I don't know.
It's tough. I mean, for me, it sort of got out from under me to some extent. I started making these boat shoes with Sperry, which seemed like a pretty simple idea. And then all of a sudden, it sort of became a trend, which was awesome for our brand. It really helped validate what we were doing and all of that. But somehow, this idea of nostalgia and American heritage and, things made in America and going back to the roots and all that stuff became the message and what everybody was doing. And it was really a struggle to sort of like rein what we were doing in and sort of make sure it was even more specific to avoid that whole, it's not just about nostalgia anymore. It's really about me. I mean, you look at my Instagram or anything like that.
Right. Well, I wonder if you just said something meaningful in answering your own question. You said it's really about you. If I think about some kinds of visual nostalgia in the fashion world, like, for example, the incredibly perfect and beautifully elaborated world of Anglophilia, of East Coast patrician Anglophilia, that is played out in the ad campaigns of Ralph Lauren. Like that's a beautiful, beautiful recreation of a certain fantasy of the past. And what you're doing, I think it's not about recreating this fantasy of the past, but it's rather taking these specific details from your own biography and trying to blow them up.
Yeah, put them in modern context for sure, and then shoot it with a Polaroid on like super old film.
Yeah, but that's just sort of a contrarian thing, isn't it?
You know what? It's not. It's actually truly what I've said before. It was a purely practical thing, really. And then another thing that sort of, another thing that sort of gets away from you. You start doing something, and then you create this expectation for who you are, and you sort of have to stay within that context. But no, it's, and they're also just beautiful,
Yeah.
Pickles.
Yeah, look at that. Pickles.
Dill pickles.
Look at the golden glow around those pickles.
It's pretty.
Antique jar, I mean, like, listen, that's, like if you're capable of feeling nostalgic and homesick by looking at pickles, that's what I'm trying to do with that picture. You may not have that capacity, I don't know. But
I do.
But it's trying to, it's like home. There's some idea in Saving the Season about home, and I think that, like in Saving the Season, I'm trying to work out my relationship to home, and the idea is that I give it to you, and then you get to work out your relationship to home, and I think that is, like the book is instructional, but not, what's the word that I want? Oh shoot, sorry. It's instructional, but it doesn't require you to be a certain way.
You're not like following some sort of new way of, it's not like a self-help book or something telling you to look at your past to solve your future or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, thank goodness for that.
Yeah, thank goodness for that. But I'm still interested in this question that he asked about what's the difference between nostalgia, where's the line between nostalgia and twee? Because I think it's a really important question.
It's really tough, and I'm very offended when people say we're twee. I can't at all deal with that. I don't know why.
Oh God,
it seems like such a horrible insult. Yeah.
Cute, I don't much like either, but
I'm
twee
horrible
is
with cute, but
worse.
I've actually acknowledged that we make cute clothes, and I can deal with that. It's fine. They're super cute. Done.
Tell me more about starting with Polaroids and shooting. So Scott does something that's really unusual, which is that he shoots his own campaigns. And he's done that from the beginning, and he's still doing it today. And it's really a brand marker for him at this point. But it's a sort of peculiar thing for an aspiring fashion designer to have started doing, and for a successful fashion designer to now be doing. So just tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I'm a total control freak, so I like everything to be under my... I am a control freak. But no, I was telling Nicole, who works with me and has worked with me for a very long time, the other day, as we were shooting the latest sort of newer version of this. This is one of my favorite things about my job. Just the process of designing clothes and then showing the clothes to the industry and then producing the clothes and shipping the clothes and then doing a campaign. It's quite long and exhausting, and you sort of always... You're looking at this stuff for a long time, really a year and a half. But there's something about taking the pictures that they start to feel fresh again to me. And at the point I'm at in the process of whatever the next season is, which is probably like, fall 2020 or whatever, it's a good way to like reconnect with what you did and not self-congratulate, but just sort of see the clothes on a real person, because we generally shoot them. This is a model who we worked with years ago, but on not totally real people, like famous people who were real but then became famous and unreal. But they're real people. And I love it. Again, it was a practical thing at the beginning. It was, I started this business, I just took investors on, a couple months ago. I started this business with a couple credit cards and a little bit of savings, so I wasn't about to hire Jürgen Teller or Mario to do the lookbook. But no, it's photography is something I just love it. I mean, you shot your whole book.
Yeah, I did. And
was it ever? I mean, at the beginning, I kind of remember you thinking were you thinking about hiring other people? Did it seem like?
Not really. Because the book started as a blog, I had to have images for the blog. A blog, like a magazine, is a visual medium, essentially. I mean, there are words on it, but it's really, if you want people to look at it, if you want people to stick around, if you want people to come back, you have to give them some attractive visuals. Another thing I learned from W, right? So I was obligated to take pictures. And what I found was the blog was my way of playing hooky from W. And taking pictures was my way of playing hooky from writing the blog. Because I'm a writer, working with visuals was this really loose, spontaneous, free, relaxing, sort of weekendy thing to do. It was a treat. But then once I got kind of a handle on what I wanted to be doing, I didn't want to, let go of the pictures. At that point, I had a very clear idea of what sorts of images I wanted for the blog, and how I wanted to go back to the sort of beginning of sort of creating a world. I had this very clear idea of what sort of a world I wanted to create, and I figured that due to the miracle of digital photography, I could get there.
Well, yeah. I mean, the reality is anybody can kind of get there now. Right, like I was at Perry Photo, and a nice but slightly obnoxious friend said something about, what did he say? He just thought photography was totally irrelevant because of Instagram and and iPhones, because anybody could take a picture. I thought, okay, you're kind of being a dick, but you're making a point, which then I went back around and I could really pick out what were the incredible photographs, the really art, but I don't consider myself a photographer. It's part of my process. It's part of what I do.
That's right.
It's part of band.
That's right.
I wouldn't ever think of myself as a fine art photographer or anything. And generally, when there's too much equipment around, I'm super nervous.
There's another thing that I'll say that's a little bit of a confession. So if you're a staff writer at a glossy magazine like W, you basically have the short end of the stick, right? Yeah. Because the ones, the photographers, they get the glory and they get the money and they get the pages and they get the first class tickets and all the rest of it. And there was a moment when I was, working on the blog and sort of, starting to think in the direction, at least of the book, when I thought, well, damn, I can do that, It was almost a slightly like a chip on the shoulder kind of thing. Sure. Like, I can do that. I mean, I agree very much with the distinction you're making between sort of great photographers and photographers who are, artists, and photographers who are creating images for consumption in the culture, of this moment. And the latter, working photographers who are creating images to consume, like that's totally legit. But and then there's an artist who's doing something and who's working in a different way, and there's a different kind of production. So
and a conceptual bent.
Yeah, and a conceptual bent. So I'm not trying to make any claims to artistry, but just to being able to make stuff.
Make stuff, totes.
Yeah.
All right, should we talk about Hollywood? We both live in LA, and we both are not in the film industry. And primarily what I do is not here at all, the version at least of my little fashion company. How do you, you started in New York, then you were in Paris and came here. Do you think you could be doing what you're doing now living in Manhattan?
No, for two reasons. One, if you are living in Manhattan and you have a job, it probably soaks up so much of your life that you don't have a lot of, sort of free time. And two, there's just not space, Like I wrote the book and shot the book in this house in Laurel Canyon. And the house, the house was it was the fixed point for the writing of the book and all of that. But it also was it was room to sprawl, And I think that the actual literal space of Los Angeles was really important.
It's super important. There's literal space and of course this like figurative space idea where you're so separated from this. I'm so separated from this dialogue that's always sort of going on and this sort of social scene that's always going on, which for me, being totally socially anxious, makes it possible for me to like function and feel even confident to put new ideas out there into the fashion dialogue or whatever. I think if I was in New York, not only would space be an issue, because I like describe New York, my trips as now kind of like 4-day extended panic attacks from the time I land until the time I come back here. It's so intense. But it's, I think the literal space thing is actually super important too. You're right.
The literal space thing, and just this, the distance is from New York, from the center of production is it's an imaginative distance as well. It gives you, it's the distance of the observer, it's the distance of the critic. Like if you're right in the thick of something, it's difficult to step back from it and to critique it. And I think that part of what Scott is doing with Band of Outsiders is he is building a fashion company that in some ways is offering a critique of fashion companies or of the fashion industry. And I think that sort of insider-outsider status is made possible by the fact that you're participating in the industry from this distance.
Yes, it's like confounding to people in the fashion industry. They don't at all get it, the choice or how it's done, and it sucks. I love living here. I would never do this anywhere else, but practically everything we do, from where a factory is to where most design talent is or management talent, it's like you're shipping people from Paris to come work for you or hoping to. It's a bummer.
There's a value just in being away from good advice, if I can put it that way. Yeah. Like if you were in New York, maybe you wouldn't have shot your campaigns by yourself. Maybe you wouldn't be sort of rethinking the way you show stuff, because good advice, sound professional advice would steer you in a more conventional direction. Do you think that's feasible?
Yeah, I
plausible?
do. I mean, I don't know if it would steer me.
Well, he is
Usually it
pretty
would just
stubborn.
sort of push me the other way.
But it makes me think of this this anecdote that I've told you before about interviewing Robert Irwin for a story I was doing in W Magazine, and Irwin, who is the coolest guy at 85 or whatever he is, Irwin was talking about the moment that he decided in the 1950s to leave New York and to having lived in New York to come back to the West Coast to establish himself as an artist in Los Angeles. And the reason, he said, is that he understood that colossi ruled New York, that abstract expressionism, that the giants of abstract expressionism, that de Kooning were these just vaunting figures who would crush him and, or overshadow him or give him no room to grow or something. But his entire practice would be defined by abstract expressionism if he stayed in New York. So what did he do? He left New York. And out here, no one cared about him. No one paid any attention. There was no one here to, to really worry about what he was doing one way or the other. And it was that escape, it was that solitude in a way that he said was so essential to his formation as an artist. The world is much smaller now, of course, than it was then, but still, I think that Los Angeles does benefit in a way from that same kind of dynamic, that you kind of get a little bit left alone, a little bit forgotten maybe, if you're out here.
Yeah, I mean, it still feels that way with artists. I mean, it's different now in the last 5 years or whatever from my very distant perspective through my, two good friends out there in 113 and 114 or wherever they are. But, yeah, for sure. I like it here, Hollywood. And then we put up a slide, bad New York. Bad New York. What else? Oh, we talked about this, storytelling. Jason Schwartzman falling down the stairs. You killed somebody and then cleaned it up and you sang.
In working on the book, I just loved these moments in the kitchen when you're working on stuff. When you're working with your hands and you just suddenly you look up and it's like bloody murder around the kitchen. And I thought, and there was this day when I was pitting cherries for cherry jam, and it literally looked like bloody murder.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. That's the last page of the book. No caption.
None needed. We're going to talk about famous people.
This is good. Yeah.
I mean, what can you actually, you interviewing Brad Pitt or Meryl Streep and Lindsay Lohan, really, truly, can you make any connection from any of that to what your life is now? Or do you choose to sort of...
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, I don't know if this is exactly the answer that you're looking for, but I think that the power of celebrity is so great in the culture today that even someone like a magazine writer who, did a couple of profiles of big movie stars, accrues a certain kind of reflected, reputation, let's put it that way. So I think that a big part of the reason I was able to sell this book is because I was the W Magazine writer who was making jam. Fast lane to slow food. It was a gimmick. It was a shtick almost. Yeah. I mean, it was very genuine. And I'm the earnest one, and so and all of that. But still, but as a sales pitch to the New York publishing world, it's almost like W Magazine editor goes rogue and starts making jam.
Yeah, it's the best soundbite. I quit CAA 12 years ago, and every article written about me, no matter how bitty, somehow manages to include that. I don't care.
Well, you've been very effective at using celebrity as a sort of turbo booster for your brand. Talk about that.
Yeah. And honestly, and this is going to sound like bullshit, but it was completely organic. It wasn't, when we started shooting these campaigns, it was a model and then a couple friends, and this is going to just sound gross, but Michelle Williams walked up to me at a party and said, "I love your clothes. I bought this pea coat, and I met my best friend because of your pea coat because she bought the same pea coat, and it was this great little story." And she basically offered herself up to us to be a muse and a model. And yeah, it just sort of started that way. And then we worked with Jason Schwartzman, who also just sort of loved the clothes and all that stuff. So, I get asked a lot, like, you're friends with these people, right? They're your buddies and all that stuff. And I say, yes, of course. They're going to hang out with Frank Ocean right after this talk. But it's not that at all. I think we're not naive about it, and we're not earnest about it, and we're not, it's super important. We're a tiny brand with like no marketing budget at all. And we get a good amount of attention from this stuff. As much as you can get when you distribute it, it's all online. We're not buying ads or anything like that. I'm interested in actors and musicians and personalities, and as somebody who's made clothes long enough and taken pictures long enough, like it's aside from the juice and culture and the sound bites and all that stuff, there is something you would hear it at CAA all the time. And it would sound so douchey because you heard it at CAA. But somebody would walk in the room and say, he's a movie star. I remember when Heath Ledger was signed at CAA, my boss, it was his first big client. And he said that, and I rolled my eyes. And then I met Heath, and I'm like, holy shit, this guy's a movie star. And again, it's not about I want to be friends with this person or associate with this person, but taking a picture of somebody who has that sort of power, it's pretty good. It's a pretty easy picture to take.
It's fascinating. That when you said that, it made me think of this story that I did with Brad Pitt. It was one of the most interesting experiences for me during the 13 years I was at W. Not because it was a very interesting interview, not because the story was very interesting, but just because it was an opportunity to watch at close quarters someone who has genius, and the genius is expressed as a physical presence, and it was like watching a wild animal at close quarters. There was just something visually captivating about his every move or non-move. And I think that was the moment when I really understood this, that there is such a thing as charisma, there is such a thing as a star, and it's the food world certainly has its charismatic leaders as well. Someone like Alice Waters, who was influential for me when I was young, even though we had only the briefest meeting, which I talk about in the book. She, I've met her sort of in more recent years and have been so struck by, her as a sort of a personality and as a personage, but also at the way that she has been able to, what do you want to say? I guess inspire people, maybe is one sort of slightly sort of drippy way to say it. But she has a force of personality that is moving.
Yeah, she's cool.
Yeah.
She's cool. Okay, I feel like we should take questions. What do you think? We got a question from Kranz. We got to get you a mic. He asked where you get the jars for the pickling.
What do you call it? Flea markets. Flea markets and junk shops. Yeah.
I've got a mic now. I was wondering, Kevin, knowing how many books you have in your library, were there art, and because you've brought together material from different subjects like art and cooking and also different, you have emails, were there any art books that really influenced how this came together? Or were you looking at art books?
Yeah, oh my God, looking at art books all the time. I was, this will sound ridiculous, I know, but there was a show of August Sanders' work at the Getty several years ago, and the catalog that accompanied it was, in 5 volumes in a slipcovered. And I do have the name right, Annie? August Sanders, early 20th century photographer who photographed who set out to document the people of Germany. And it was like this incredible almost sort of ethnographic or anthropological documentation of a nation, right? The pictures are so staggeringly beautiful. They could not be more plain, but they could not be more, they could not be plainer, and they could not be more full of information. You know, like, this is what a pastry chef looks like. But that pastry chef, you've probably seen this picture. You know, he's like this big fat guy with like a hat, and he's like beating a big bowl full of egg whites. In that picture, you understand a whole world and a whole life. And I thought, if I could ever take a picture that is as straightforward as that, and is also as full of narrative and emotion as that, then I would consider myself happy. Now, I haven't, but those pictures were a really important inspiration. And there's an 18th century Spanish still life painter called Luis Melendez, who was also a big inspiration. He was commissioned by the Princess of Asturias, who was the daughter-in-law of the king, to paint a series of comestibles, is the way that he described it in a letter. The comestibles were meant to illustrate the riches, the edible riches, the agricultural riches of Spain in this moment. And he conceived it as a series of paintings to be done over the course of the year. The original conception was some 400 and whatever pictures. And he painted fruits and vegetables and recipes essentially in process. Like some of the paintings are essentially a recipe. You know, there's cucumbers and there's a cruet of vinegar and there's a tub of oil and then there's a thing of salt and then there's a knife and there's a bowl and so on and so forth. Well, the Princess of Asturias fired him, and so he only got to paint, let's say 70 or 100 paintings. But what he was doing was saving the season. What he was doing was looking at the agricultural world as a subset of the natural world, as a part of the natural bounty, as the sort of the national riches of Spain. And he was recording them not in an idealized way, but he was recording them, these fruits and vegetables, as they would be seen on the countertop of an average domestic household in Spain at that time. And to me, again, that was so meaningful that he was interested in things as they were. He was interested in documentation. He was interested in the reality of a moment. So that's a long-winded answer, I know, Bettina, but yes. So looking at art books was very important during this process.
Hands up. Raise those hands. I see a couple there. Okay. Guy right there with the glasses, or lady right there with the ponytail. Either one. There we go. Ladies
Hello. I'm Grace. I lived with David for 3 wonderful years.
Oh, dear
which
Lord.
is where I developed my green thumb. So my question is for you, Kevin. I guess the idea of saving the season, gardening is so bound to time, and right now I feel like my Cherokee purples, like, they're not going to do well because I planted them, a week and a half late. What am I going to do? I have not read your book. Of course, I've heard many wonderful things about you from David. But what is your relationship to gardening?
None. None.
There we go. Thank you very much. Good night.
Next question. No. So my grandparents, my West grandparents, my family on both sides is from East Tennessee, from Blount County, Tennessee, which is right at the foothills of the Smokies. And my mom's side, my dad's side are farmers. My mom's side are hillbillies. And and Gran and Papa, my West grandparents, the book is dedicated to them, and they, memories of them go throughout the book, and that's really that is the seat of the nostalgia for my childhood, and so I've seen what farmers actually do, and at the very end of his life, Papa was 85, and he would die that winter. That spring, late spring, he took me around the farm, and we went through a walk in one of the pastures and looked at the cow herd, and it was like this beautiful morning. And he said all kinds of things which have stuck with me, and one of them was essentially, he was saying how great his life had been living on the farm, but he said, son, there's a big difference between being a farmer and living on a farm. By which I think he meant it's like perfectly nice to like live out in the country, but being a farmer is like real work, and it's not my work. I'm a writer. I'm a reporter. Scott, are you a farmer?
I am not.
My question was about nostalgia, and since you just mentioned it, what do you think of nostalgia in this way that it becomes almost like a trend or this collective unconscious necessarily when, things of like the 80s are being prevalent, or like, is it a generational thing, and how do you keep it personal, but not keep it too personal to like alienate readers or customers or...
That's a great question. Listen, at the end of the day, we talk about this all the time. Now I can clearly see who the guy in the glasses is. We're making great clothes that people really, really want to wear. And the story behind them and whatever that inspiration is, outside of the context of all the noise, is totally irrelevant. It's that moment in a store when somebody's connecting to this or whatever it is. And in terms of the imagery, it's tough. I think for us, Wyatt, it's about consistency and this sort of really, we just keep doing our thing, and we evolve, certainly. But I think we can own that little slice of what we're doing. For you, I can't answer.
Yeah. So the question is, is it a trend? Is it a movement? Is there some cultural shift? Is there some
Or is it just humanity and how we sort of function looking at the past?
Yeah. I think Scott and I actually may disagree on this slightly. I think that there are. Let's see. So I do think that there is some general sort of pendulum swing in the culture that is a response, to what happened, sort of several years ago, and that we're swinging away from one thing and we're swinging towards another thing. And I'm not sure I want to define too precisely what those two endpoints are of the swings, but what we're seeing right now is, this fascination with artisanal food, with local food. What we're seeing is a fascination with American heritage brands like Filson, like Sperry, for that matter. What we're seeing is a fixation on the styles of earlier sort of rugged American stereotypes. The steampunk and the Brooklyn lumberjack, and like all of that sort of stuff. And I do think that all those things are related. I don't think it's a coincidence.
No question. I think they're related. I think it's actually with fashion, the reality is it's sort of over. At least the blatant sort of nostalgia thing. Fashion inherently is about looking back. You talk to fashion people like buyers, and they'll describe something like, it's so, YSL from a certain year crossed with Balenciaga from another one. It's just sort of like how you describe things, because at the end of the day, there's very little that's truly, truly new. But it's tough. I mean, I think for fashion, the movement's sort of over. I think in general, it is a larger cultural trend. I don't know if it's a trend, though. I just think it's how people are. You're either a sort of nostalgic sucker for the past, or you're a cold-hearted futurist.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think given that the innovations within society are so clearly on the technological front, and that those technological innovations are so close to us in a very literal sense. It's like, this is this stuff. Like, this is our innovation today. Like, these are the things, we carry our innovations with them. We live within our innovations. And so, so like we want to get emotional warmth from someplace else. And
Throwback Thursday.
Pardon me?
Throwback Thursday.
Throwback Thursday. Yeah. Yeah. Emotional warmth comes from the past. It comes from family. It comes from like all of that kind of stuff.
DM.
I know you guys were talking about LA versus New York, but I want to hear more about your book tour, Kevin, and how being in all these sort of odd places in the country, your book was received.
Well, I guess what I would say, David, is that it seems to be a topic of interest in the parts of the country that I've seen thus far, which is to say all the way up the West Coast and then all the way through the South. That is presumably why my publisher sent me on book tour to those locations. But it does seem as if it does seem as if this artisanal stuff is all over the country. I think maybe the one comment, or maybe the one other comment I would make is that just as Scott said that in the fashion world, all of this, like this moment, that moment is over. In the really cutting edge food world, like in Brooklyn, in San Francisco, in downtown LA, the artisanal thing is like, that's no longer the thing. Like, people have blown past that and are on to the next thing. But as we know, culture diffuses from centers by this slow process of word of mouth and osmosis and who knows what. So there's like a kind of time lag. And I think what you're seeing in places like, Asheville, North Carolina, or Knoxville, Tennessee, or even perhaps Seattle, is a real big enthusiasm for stuff that would not seem that novel here anymore. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
All right. Kevin will be signing books, which everybody should go buy because it's super awesome. Thank you for coming to our talk.
Thank you.